It is now February, and I have finished reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This was something I read in my own free time. It just so happened to also line up with reading books from around the same period. So that was just kind of a weird coincidence, but yes. Wuthering Heights, it's legit, it's a fantastic novel, right? It really is. But I think that there's a lot of issues with race, but then also the perception of, is this a story about love, right? And really, the description of this, in my version at the very least, is it kind of draws you into this idea of that being love, of it being about love, right? Basically, this just describes a very over-the-top version of what the plot is, right? Which, effectively, the plot is orphan boy gets brought in to a wealthy family. That boy and the youngest daughter of the rich family fall in love, but the orphan boy is scorned and destroyed when the father dies. And so that orphan boy runs away, comes back a couple years later. The daughter is now married to someone else, and the boy, now having come back as a man, decides to attempt to destroy everyone. That's really what it is. The attempts are in retaliation and revenge, right? And so, I mean, there's certainly a couple things to discuss with this, right? If you look at this as a novel about love, right, really what you're setting up is, in modern terms, I can't think of a better way to describe it, and I think this comes from a Tumblr post, for all I care, but this idea that if you love a hero, he will still sacrifice you for the world, but if you love a villain, they will sacrifice the world for you, right? And that's exactly what happens here. Heathcliff, who is the orphan boy, comes back and effectively decides to salt the earth and destroy both families and destroy everything because he could not get married to the woman that he loved, right? I mean, that's what ends up happening here. And he uses their children, human beings, as playthings and as instruments for his revenge. So in my mind, the way that this is told, Heathcliff in no way can be redeemed, right? There's no redeeming him because, and like, sure, if maybe if he didn't bring the children into it, maybe he could be, in my mind, he could be redeemed. But the use of Hareton, Linton, and the second Catherine in the way that he does is too much for me to say that he can be redeemed, right? Especially the way that he uses and abuses the second Catherine, takes complete advantage of her naivety and desire for genuineness, right? Her desire for that, and trampled it because if he can get the second Catherine to marry his son, well, then now he gains all the assets of both families. And that's really what he does, right? That's his end goal. So yeah, right. Can you redeem someone who has put forth all these abuses? And I guess the other question is, can you love someone who has destroyed, who has done all these abuses, right? So that's kind of a question we have to hurdle. Another question we have to hurdle is the race question, because Heathcliff is described as effectively being non-white or non-English. He is brought back from London and is more or less described as, I think a couple chapters later, he's like described as, they're questioning whether he's a refugee from the Americas or whether he is, I think, from the Middle East, maybe in Northern Africa. But whatever the actual language is, he's basically being described as non-white, right? He is a person of color. And as the orphan boy who to family at this time would be considered an act of saviorism, right? He is being plucked out of horrible London society and being given an opportunity to at least do something. That is what the mind of the aristocracy is. And instead of just being that, he becomes the idol of their father's eye and is the one that they believe shall go to college and is the one that they believe shall be the one to inherit everything. And if it weren't for the fact that when the father dies, Heathcliff is still very young, that would have been the case, right? So we have to look at racial motivations, right? Because we just can't deny the fact that part of this and part of Hindley's reaction, Hindley being the older brother and the birth heir to the fortune, we have to determine whether or not, you know, part of his motivations when he comes back and he inherits everything is whether that is based on the fact that he has been usurped by someone who's not traditionally aristocracy, right? And so we then get into the treatment of Heathcliff as he's now a young lad. This is between like 13 to 17, I think. But Heathcliff is often described as being devilish or half man, and things of that nature, which you have to also think of those as being racially motivated, because for a large portion of society, that's what they were describing non-white people as. And that was their reasoning for why this group of people should be treated less, which is certainly not the case, but that was the reasoning, is that they are descendants of the devil, or that they have, or that they are less intelligent, or, you know, things of that nature, right? All those are being used as reasons as to why they should not be treating any person of color with congeniality, right? So, like, that's the other thing that we have to look at, is whether Hindley and his motivation are purely based on the fact that he has been usurped, or was attempted to be usurped, or whether it also comes from a racial standpoint. The other question we have to ask ourselves along these lines is whether we can actually trust all of the information that is given to us about Heathcliff, because the story, in the same way that Frankenstein was told, is told from one narrator telling it to another narrator. And it is Lockwood, who is our main character, right, who is being told all this by Nellie Dean, who has been a longtime caretaker, longtime housekeeper of both families, right, and effectively grew up with Heathcliff. And so we also have to ask ourselves the question is, can we trust Nellie Dean or some of her things racially motivated, right? And to that, I don't really have an answer. You know, I just don't know if there is an answer. I don't even, like, you even aspire to say that this wasn't even something that Emily Bronte wanted to bring up, right? But I think because of the fact that I think I'm correct in saying that there's no other named characters that are specifically described as being non-white. That, right, there has to be something going on with that. I guess the other thing to mention is along the lines of Dorian Gray, right? There's a lot of themes of decadence in here. There's a lot of themes about excessiveness and greed and selfishness and the use of people as tools, right? Because really, I mean, like, all of our characters that have some sort of agency, in Hindley, in Heathcliff, you know, they are full of excessiveness, and like Lipton, right, or Linton, incredibly excessive. They live in excesses, right? There's no, everything is too little for them. They have to have more. And then we see that backfire for Hindley, because Hindley effectively loses his house and loses all of his land and titles to Heathcliff because Hindley can't stop gambling. But really, Heathcliff doesn't get his comeuppance because of what I described initially, right, is where his excesses aren't actually punished. They're just pushed away because he's the lover, right? So yeah. Anything else to mention about this in terms of that sort of stuff? I guess, like, you could also really talk about the gender issues that are at play here, right? The lack of agency for really any of the women characters, which for the most part comes down to, as main characters, Catherine, the elder, the one who's the mother, Catherine the younger, who is the daughter, and then Nellie Dean, who's the housekeeper, who's also the main narrator throughout all this. And then there's also Zalia, I believe is her name, who is a second housekeeper that gets mentioned towards the end. But none of these women have any sort of agency. They just have to accept and move on, right? And they just have to accept and live with it. And so we look at the first Catherine, right, who, although does not want to marry into the other family and wants to marry Heathcliff, has no other option because she is basically being used as a toy to strengthen relationships between the two families, right? That's what she's being used as. Oh, and then there's also, what's her name? I can't think of it right now. It'll come back to me. But it is the woman who ends up becoming Heathcliff's wife. Can't remember her name. I'm sure if I flip to a random page, I'll find it. Isabella. That's her name. Isabella is really the fourth major woman. But once again, Isabella, much like in the way that the first Catherine was used, Isabella is also gets abused and has very little agency in things, because she effectively gets tricked into marrying Heathcliff, and then as soon as the two are married, right, Heathcliff has been putting on the show of love and adoration. As soon as they are married, he does not give a shit about her, does not care, right? But what the marriage does is it gives Heathcliff a right to claims in the Linton household, right? In the Linton family. That's what it does. That's why he marries her. And so, right, as soon as they are married, he doesn't care. Isabella does have some motive of agency because she's still very close with her brother, has the opportunity to run away, have their child, Heathcliff and Isabella's child, in London, and is able to raise him there for a little bit until she dies, and Linton, who is the child, is brought back and forced to live with Heathcliff. So Isabella has very little agency in this. Second Catherine has what she believes is a lot of agency, but reality is none. She's being played like a fiddle, because she has not been exposed to anything in her life, because she's been effectively held in shelter by her father, and so she has no concept of what the outside world's like, and therefore gets tricked. Her naivety is used against her into marrying Linton, who was her cousin, and then they just let Linton die because Linton was already on the brink of death. But that marriage then forces the younger Catherine to give up basically all of her claims to anything to Heathcliff, right? And that's how Heathcliff ends up destroying everything, right? Is because Heathcliff now has the rightful claim to both families' possessions, and he can do whatever he wants with them. And then there's Nellie Dean. Nellie Dean doesn't have any agency in this, but for a slightly different reason. Instead of being a member of the aristocracy, she is a member of the serving class, right? And that's what gives her no agency, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what she does, because they can just replace her if they wanted to. And so, right, she's allowed to speak a little more freely, and she's allowed to be a little more open, but at the end of the day, she has to serve everyone else, and she has no agency in that. But yeah, that's Wuthering Heights. Really fantastic novel. I would not consider a romance. If you're looking for romance, this is not it. This is a horrible, terrible tragedy, filled with many a sad thing. But yeah. In terms of number rating, 7, maybe. Maybe a little bit higher, like a 7.2. But yeah, that's Wuthering Heights.